Hello everyone, my name is Ville Majamaa and I'm a board member of the European Youth Forum. I was invited to your event to talk about youth rights, what is our work on youth rights, but also how you can engage in local, regional, national or European level. I apologize for not being there in person, but I hope that the following presentation, which I will also share with you with slides, will help you get this idea. And off we go. What I wanted to cover in this short video, I hope it will be short, is first a little bit about what is the European Youth Forum, what is that we are. Second, why should we talk about youth rights? What do we mean when we say youth rights? Thirdly, what is the youth rights advocacy work that we do? And finally, how can we support your work? What kind of tools and services we have developed to support your work on youth rights? So if we start from what is the European Youth Forum? As many of you might know, the European Youth Forum stands for a European platform for youth organizations. So we bring together over 100 organizations, which themselves are platforms and umbrella organizations of young people. So we have two kinds of members. We have national youth councils and we have international non-governmental youth organizations. We have representation from almost all Council of Europe countries, so this is one thing to bear in mind. Our work goes beyond the European Union, even if European Union is crucially important for youth in Europe. The European Youth Forum is entirely run by young people. All the board members are volunteers, and we have a legal age gap, which is 35 years old. So if you're over 35, you cannot be elected to a position in the Youth Forum. Collectively, we represent tens of millions of youth in Europe. What do we do? Our mission is to be the voice of young people in Europe and to advance the interests and the rights of youth in European and global contexts. So that's us. And in the board, we have 11 volunteers, as I said. I'm one of them, and I happen to be the one responsible for youth rights, so thus I'm the one talking to you now. Now, what about youth rights? The first question we often get is, should young people have different rights from the other people? And this is not the case. Youth rights are human rights. But there's the problem. Young people often can't access their fundamental human rights. And it's a bit like with children and with women. We talk about women's rights. Do they have more rights than men? No. We talk about children's rights. Do they have more rights than other groups in society? No. But because these groups are more vulnerable than the mainstream groups in society, this means we need to make sure that there's an extra effort so that also these groups can access their fundamental rights. This is why we talk about youth rights. We see that in many ways in Europe, young people face age-based discrimination. When you see a job advertisement saying that there's a pay of X euros per month for a regular job, and then in the small print it says, but if you're under 23, we will pay you less. That is age-based discrimination. When you see that less than 2% of members of national parliaments globally are under 30, there is a problem with age-based discrimination there as well. So we're not talking about new rights, we're not talking about more rights, we're talking about accessing the same rights that we already should have an access to, but we don't because of our age, because we're young. So our claim is, and this is at the core of youth rights idea, that there are specific situations due to the young age of us, why there are specific barriers in accessing our rights. And we want to change the conversation from perceiving young people as beneficiaries of policies to rights holders. At the same time, we want to change the perception of governments and politicians from being somehow benevolent and serving the young people out of their goodwill sometimes, to being duty bearers. So we want to talk about duty bearers who have a duty to ensure the rights of rights holders. This is the narrative implicit in the youth rights idea. How this works out in practice, there are two ways. First, we want to implement so-called rights-based approach in our own work. So the rights-based approach means to look at the world and to plan our activities from the perspective that young people are rights holders. Secondly, we advocate for youth rights. So we advocate for this concept and for this recognition that young people face specific barriers. These are the two things we do to promote youth rights. And I will tell you a bit more about that next. So our youth rights advocacy, this is the political side of it, can be divided in global and European levels. So globally, we mostly work with the United Nations system. And in the United Nations system, there are various ways in which we advocate for youth rights. The most obvious one is the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is located in Geneva, which is convenient for a European platform. In this council, young people have traditionally not been much on the agenda. Neither has young people's rights. But this has changed in the last 2 years. The first ever resolution on youth and human rights was adopted in 2016 in the UN Human Rights Council. It was not a fantastic resolution, but it was a start. And progressively from there, we have gotten somewhere. Last year, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution which demanded a global study to be carried out on young people's human rights. And this was a significant moment because in the end, the study was published earlier this year in August. And the study made some recommendations on young people's situation and what should be done to address it. Surprisingly, perhaps for the United Nations, but definitely not for us, the recommendations are very much in line with what we've been claiming for the past 5 years in the United Nations context. The stories, the data, the evidence in the study supports our claims. Young people face age-based discrimination, and the current human rights mechanisms are inadequate in addressing the rights violations that we are facing. So this is one big process. I've also, in the slides you will see later, I've mentioned that some of these things that I will now cover are either a resource that you can use, or they are a process that you can get involved in. So these 2 points I mentioned, the UN human rights process in the Council, that is something you can get involved in because Spain is actually a member of the UN Human Rights Council. And second point, this study which I mentioned is a great resource to use also nationally, regionally and locally to advance youth rights. The other things I wanted to mention in the UN context are the Universal Periodic Review process and the UN Youth Strategy. The Universal Review process is a process which assesses state behavior against the UN Human Rights Declaration. So basically, every now and then, all the states globally are subjected to a review process where other states will then make recommendations on how these states should improve their domestic legislation to ensure their citizens access to rights. Traditionally, youth have not been on the agenda in these discussions. But in the past couple of years, we have now been supporting our member organizations to submit to make submissions to the UN Human Rights Council on the issues that are relevant for youth. And there are some examples of how this has worked out in practice. The last point, as I said, is the UN Youth Strategy, which was adopted earlier this year. This was a phenomenal document, not only because it's the first UN Youth Strategy ever, but from the perspective of youth rights because it recognizes young people as rights holders. And this is a fantastic tool to lobby, to push, to promote the idea of youth rights, of rights-based approach in every context. In the European level, we must distinguish between European Union and Council of Europe, which are two separate institutions with quite separate powers and competencies. That's a whole another discussion, but let's just say EU has more power over member states or more shared power and Council of Europe less. On the other hand, Council of Europe covers geographically much wider area than the European Union. If we start from the Council of Europe, there are two things I would like to mention. The first one is the Young People's Access to Rights recommendation from 2016. This was a process that took about 10 years, and at the end of a very long advocacy process, the Council of Ministers of the Council of Europe finally unanimously adopted this recommendation. It's a fantastic and very progressive text, recognizing many of the issues that we have also been advocating for, also making excellent recommendations for the governments on how to address these challenges young people have. Now, the challenge of this instrument is that it is a recommendation and not a binding document. However, it's been formally adopted by all the Council of Europe member states, 47 member states. So for a civil society like we or like you, it is a fantastic tool to push the governments and try to keep them accountable. So have a look at that. The second point under Council of Europe, which I wanted to mention, is the collective complaint procedure. So under Council of Europe, there is something called European Social Charter. Now, not all countries have signed all the parts that are relevant for young people under the European Social Charter, but some countries have. In fact, there are about 15 countries in Europe that have signed a part of this charter, which allows civil society actors, like the Youth Forum, to take legal action against these governments if they don't fulfill their obligations under this charter. We are currently in a legal process against Belgium on the issue of unpaid internships, as an example, and we are hopefully still working on it, lodging a second collective complaint against another European government on the issue of unequal welfare payments. So basically the issue I mentioned earlier, if you're younger, you're paid less, and that's somehow okay. So this is called the collective complaint procedure. Now, if Spain has signed this particular part, you should absolutely look into the charter and see if the Spanish government is actually fulfilling its obligations. Sorry. If Spain has not signed the charter, the logical next step is to push the government to sign it. So that was Council of Europe. In the EU context, the two main partners for us are the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency and the Equinet. EU's Fundamental Rights Agency is the agency in the European Union responsible for monitoring the fundamental rights of EU citizens. So if we compare to the European Social Charter, or if we compare to the UN Human Rights Declaration, in fact, the EU is still a bit more progressive when it comes to fundamental rights. However, the monitoring work on whether young people can access these rights is really not there. So what we are trying to do is to raise this issue with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency and push them to do more work to monitor young people's access to rights as opposed to all the other groups in society. The second stakeholder I mentioned is Equinet. Equinet is an umbrella organization of national equality bodies. So all EU member states by law must have a national equality body. You should check out what that is called in Spanish. I actually don't know. It is the role of these national equality bodies to ensure that the rights of the citizens in that country are fulfilled and citizens are treated equally, as the name suggests, and there is no discrimination based on any ground. Now, as discussed already, age-based discrimination is quite ripe in Europe. And often these national bodies don't really look at this aspect. It is not because they don't want to or they don't care. It's that this idea of rights-based, this idea of age-based discrimination is not very common. We have to all collectively do more work to introduce this idea. It's not that someone is against, it's that they just haven't thought about it. So that's another opportunity for you to get involved in. This was very briefly, and I appreciate it was very complex, but I promise you will get the slides, and the slides have text, and then you can Google, and there's my contact information, so you can call me and ask me what on earth I meant. But I don't want to get into any more depth in institutional advocacy in this video. Instead, I wanted to say a couple of things about how we can support your work. So first of all, I wanted to mention that we do support you if you want to engage in the universal periodic review process. So if you want to make a submission to the UN Human Rights Council, we have experts, we have countries who have done this with us, and we can link you up with either our experts or these countries and make sure that this is a quality submission and it will be taken on board by other member states. We also have made so-called Youth Rights Info Tool, which is hopefully addressing this issue of people just not being aware of this idea of youth rights and young people as rights holders. I have a screenshot of the tool and the website address in the slides, which I will share with you. We also have something called Quality Standards on Youth Policy tool, which might be familiar for some of you, but in case not, it's basically an effort from our members, members of the Youth Forum, to define what is quality youth policy. And our members came up with 8 standards, the first standard being rights-based. We have 8 standards, and under each standard there are assessment criteria and indicators. And it's basically a self-assessment tool. You can sit down in your city, in your town, in your country, even in the EU level, and go through the policy-making process in your context with this tool and see to what extent it fulfills the quality standards. So definitely something you can use on any level. Another point which we are doing is the so-called rights-based approach training module. So we have a pool of trainers, fantastic experts who are there just waiting for organizations like you to contact us and ask for services. Rights-based approach training is not the only training module we do. There are also training modules on communications, advocacy, finances, etc. We also have a webinar capacity building program. But for what's relevant for this presentation is that if you are interested in rights-based approach and how to implement that in your organization, you can do so by requesting this training. And finally, there's a lot of research and data that can be useful in youth rights advocacy. We have recently published a report on young people's participation in political parties. There's another report coming up soon on civic space, youth civic space, and the problems we have there. We recently launched so-called Youth Progress Index, which is a fantastic tool that I would definitely recommend you look up on our website. That's more or less it in terms of services. What I wanted to finish with is a couple of quotes. And actually I will only give you one, and the other you can read in the slides, and hopefully that, if nothing else, will encourage you to have a look at them. So I would like to put you a question, but I actually cannot see if you know the answer, so I will just give everyone half a minute to think after I read this quote, who do you think it's from? So the quote goes as follows. I invite all of you to extend my youth envoy all possible support in advancing youth rights and priorities. I repeat, I invite all of you to extend my youth envoy all possible support in advancing youth rights and priorities. This quote is from 21st September 2017 from the United Nations Secretary General. So it's not impossible to make high-level politicians aware and understand the concept of youth rights, the reality of struggling against age-based discrimination. The UN Secretary General gets it. Not every government gets it, but we're getting there. And I really hope that this can be our common project. We do it in Brussels, and you do it wherever you can. And together, we will get there. I hope this presentation was useful. There is a bit more information still on the slides, and as there you can also find my contact information. There's a lot of resources on the website. I mentioned a couple of things that I would really hope you to look up, such as the Youth Rights Info Tool and the Youth Progress Index. But in any case, I wish you a very successful event, and thank you for the invitation and being interested in youth rights. Thank you very much.